Hello and welcome to this webinar from IEDP Developing Leaders. I am Roddy Miller and you are all very welcome indeed. We've got a fantastic topical topic coming up today with Ella Washington. I just want to, as usual, just hold back for a few minutes before I introduce Ella formally. And just allow a few more people. We've had a huge demand for this webinar, and we're already up to almost 200 people online, but I think there are a few more to come. So let's just keep talking for a minute or two before we start the official proceedings. But I think there are a good number of you who are very familiar with our webinars, IEDP Developing Leaders, but there's also a good number who are new to us. So maybe I can just take the opportunity to give you a little bit of background about what we do here. We have been around for a decade and a half, almost back to the beginning of the millennium, and we work very closely with the leading global business schools for their executive education, and we see ourselves as a bridge between the academic side and the corporate side, and try and bring the two together as much as we possibly can. And as a result of that, we have strong relationships with business schools around the world, and particularly today with Georgetown in Washington, DC. We know that at this particular time of the COVID crisis, there's been all sorts of new pressures and new demands on both corporates and indeed on the education sector. And these webinars have been a hugely powerful way of bringing people together and sharing information and creating connections. So I'm sure that we will be able to do a bit more of that today. Excellent. Well, we're now 2 or 3 minutes in, and I think we've got almost 250 people online, so let's start the main proceedings of the day. I am, as I say, delighted to have Professor Ella Washington, who's a professor of practice at Georgetown University's McDonagh School of Business in Washington, D.C. Ella focuses, as the title of today's webinar suggests, on diversity and inclusion, and as you might imagine, over the last week, 10 days, she has been very much in demand. So we're hugely privileged that she's able to have time to join us today. Ella, welcome to the IEDP webinar.
Thank you so much, Roddy. I'm so happy to be here.
I know you've because of recent events and this, we've been talking about this webinar since back, I think, almost before COVID crisis began. So we're now into we've had the COVID crisis. We've now got this big issue around diversity too. So I know you are going to inevitably touch on the events that have been emerging around the world, but started in Minneapolis 2 weeks ago. But just to build the factor that, you know, this is diversity wider than race we're talking about here, so we want that when I've finished, or when Ella's finished her presentation, we will have a Q&A and very much want questions from everybody who's listening. So use the question panel at that point. But at this stage, let me hand swiftly over to Ella and we'll take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roddy.
Okay, you should have the screen now.
All righty, I think we are a go. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. Really happy to share just some thoughts with you today, and I welcome your questions and hope this can be an exciting dialogue for all of us. So a little bit about me, my background. I grew up in Durham, North Carolina, here in the United States, in a single-parent household. Now, Durham has a rich and also challenging history around race, particularly. During the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, Durham became known as actually the Black Wall Street, and it was the economic powerhouse for Black people. In his visit to Durham, Booker T. Washington said, "Of all the southern cities I have visited, I found here the sanest attitude of white people towards the Blacks. And so surprisingly, as this was a southern city, there were some good race relations and Blacks were able to thrive. So this is about kind of my hometown and some of the race relations, but also during the time in which I grew up, there were many issues of racial disparities. I remember personally protests at our school board meetings for racially motivated redistricting in our school zones. Then we had what those of us in the United States may remember as the Duke lacrosse scandal when I was in high school, which although the court case was actually about sexual harassment, which is also a diversity, equity, and inclusion challenge, in the media, the case actually became about race specifically, when the 3 perceived wealthy white lacrosse players from Duke were acquitted from the accused rape charge, which seemed unjust to the woman who accused them, who was a Black student from the Black college in North Carolina Central University. So, my understanding and my thoughts around race have been formed from an early age, some positive, some negative. And that led me to want to dig deeper in my professional career to understand not only race, but also gender and many other inequities that we face, and not only in our society, but in our world. So just a little bit about me. My approach is informed by both theory and practice. I'm not your traditional researcher. I'm not your traditional practitioner. I really value the intersection of how what we understand from a theory-based perspective can really influence and enhance our practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. My consulting background has really helped to strengthen my application of what we know from research. I was a consultant at the Gallup organization and Ernst & Young, as well as the United States Federal Reserve System. And so all of that has kind of poured into what I think today is important in terms of strategies for success for diversity and inclusion. Now, as Roddy mentioned, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge our kind of current state of what's happening, particularly around issues of race in the United States and also globally. On May 25th, George Floyd, an African-American man, was killed by police during an arrest in Minneapolis. In response to Floyd's death, there were protests against police brutality and against injustice against Black people in the United States, but also internationally. So this particular moment in time is critically important for us. Organizations, for the first time for many, are speaking up and committing to anti-racism action in a way that we honestly haven't seen before. Yet the challenge is that many leaders are wondering about their internal DE&I culture. So that's what we're here to discuss today, to really understand what leaders should be doing in organizations around their culture, and particularly for many of you on the line that are HR and DEI leaders, specifically yourself, what should you be doing? So recently, I've had 2 major publications around this topic of what leaders should be doing next. My article with my co-author, Laura Morgan Roberts, U.S. Businesses Must Take Meaningful Action Against Racism, featured in Harvard Business Review, talked specifically about the missteps leaders should be avoiding during this time, but also what they should be doing in order to move the needle forward on their diversity and inclusion culture. While conventional diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives focus usually on employee engagement, belongingness, today's challenges really make us pay attention to very specific issues around race. Research shows that how organizations respond to diversity-related events, whether it be on race, on gender, on LGBTQ+, how organizations respond to these external events does have an impact on how employees internally think about their place in the organization and how psychologically safe they feel. Without adequate support, employees are likely to perceive their environments as more interpersonally and institutionally biased against them. And so leaders that are really seeking to create an inclusive environment for everyone must find ways to address these topics, even when they're uncomfortable, even when they're not exactly sure what to do next. They must still address them. So in the article, Laura Morgan Roberts and I give a high-level framework for what leaders should be doing now that many leaders have spoken up against the injustices we see. What's next? What's the next place of action? So the first thing leaders should do is acknowledge acknowledging the hurt and harm that's been done to their employees outside in the world, but also particularly within their organization. That requires you to do your research to fully understand the event, using data from reliable resources, and also taking the initiative to search beyond kind of your usual echo chamber of news sources and social media sources that might not give you the full picture of what's happening in the world. Secondly, you want to give your Black and Brown employees the space to be angry, afraid, disenchanted, or even disengaged from work. What's happening right now is tough on all of us, and it's important for leaders to give people the space to process and figure out their next steps, in their own time. And then finally, in terms of acknowledging, you want to seek out support from your human resources team or Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And I know many of us here today are in those spaces. And so you might be thinking, okay, so when everyone's coming to me now, what do I do? What do I say? What should I be thinking about? And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Books and articles can also be good resources. And so there's lots of great resources that are out right now and that you should try to leverage to deepen your knowledge on the current issues. The second thing leaders should be doing is affirming. People are looking for leaders to affirm their right to safety and personhood to help them feel protected. When presidents or governors or corporate leaders, speak up against these injustices, it makes people feel like they do actually have a place and their value within the organization. But beyond these large-scale, speeches or large-scale statements, it's important for leaders to interact on a one-on-one basis with their team. So we're not just talking about leaders at the tops of organizations, we're really talking about your local level managers. We know that 70% of employee engagement is based on your local level management relationship. And so it's not just the jobs of those at the top of our organization to be talking about diversity and inclusion in a meaningful way. It's everyone's job, and particularly important for local level managers. So in the Harvard Business Review article, we give a framework for how you might start a conversation, because we acknowledge these conversations can be tough to have. One thing you might start off with is, I've been thinking about the harm of racism in our country, if you're in the United States, or you might say in our world, if you're outside the US, especially considering recent events. Next, describe how you feel. Use this as a moment to be a little bit vulnerable and open the door for dialogue and conversation if the other person feels comfortable. You might say, I'd like to help in promoting equity, so here's one thing I plan to do to prevent future tragedies like these. Now, while that might seem like a tall order, as you can't likely prevent tragedies outside in the world, you certainly have some power and influence within the organization to make sure that issues of inequality and equity aren't continuing to be pervasive within your culture. Then lastly, under affirming, you might offer to engage. You might, say, please let me know if there's anything I can do to be supportive, even if you just want to talk about what's happening. But this last part is critically important. You have to kind of open the door for them to acknowledge what's happening, but not to engage right away. You might say, I understand if you don't want to engage, I won't be offended, but I just want you to know the door is open and that I care. A conversation like this really changes the dynamic. It's really well received and appreciated by most employees, even if at that moment they choose not to engage. I believe it's a leader's responsibility to at least kind of broach this conversation as part of being a good manager. All right. And the last part of our framework that we offer in this article is ACT. And so there's power of words, there's power of intention, but what we know is that people want to see action. The protests in the streets are about organizations and government entities putting action behind their great words. The example of Franklin Templeton with the Amy Cooper incident in the New York City Central Park was a good example of action behind statements. And so Franklin Templeton fired Amy Cooper as a result. In many organizations, there's not a transgression like Amy Cooper's that is seen on the world stage. However, there are things that happen within the organization that they have to be clear where they stand. And it might take them firing employees, or it might take them being very specific about what structural policies they're going to change and how they're going to make a difference in inequality within their own culture. So think critically as leaders about how you can use your power to affect change. You know, we've witnessed a lot of courageous steps by other organizations, and we've also witnessed some missteps, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's important for you to think about, you know, what can you do to put action behind the great words and sentiments that you may have been sharing. So that framework talks a lot about what leaders should be doing, but it's not lost on me. You might be thinking, okay, what should HR and DE&I leaders be doing? As a result, we know that many companies are revisiting their D&I strategies. And so today I want to talk a little bit about what we know from both research and best practices to understand kind of your pain points and what you should be thinking about in terms of your own diversity and inclusion strategy. So first, I want to hear a little bit from you all. What are leaders struggling with the most in the current DE&I strategy, environment? So what are you all struggling with? What are you hearing the most from your internal cultures? If you go to menti.com and use the code 136519, your answers will actually start to pop up, and we can share with each other in a word cloud format. So again, if you go to menti.com and use the code 136519, we'll start to see some of these responses. Okay. Excellent, excellent. Thank you all so much for responding here. I'll give us just another few seconds before we start to review. All right, so some of the things I'm seeing here are communication, being awkward allies, leadership commitment, acknowledgement, action, prioritizing hiring a D&I leader, transparent communication, lack of diversity effort, balancing the needs of underrepresented racial groups, denial and guilt, lack of brown and Black diversity at the top, not knowing how to respond, engagement, how to be an anti-racist, not having the right environment, overwhelming number of frameworks, tools, and recommendations. I certainly can understand that challenge, certainly. What to do, transparency, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Managers have no idea how to talk through these topics. Taking action rather than just having conversations, past failure, social distance between employees. And companies maybe have never done any of this before. These are really, really great responses. I wish we had time to read all of them. I'm going to just scroll through a few more, but hopefully you're catching some of these on your screen. Hiring diverse employees, the fear of the older workers who remember the riots, actionable change under current financial challenges, absolutely. So though we have this current understanding of what's happening in our world in terms of race relations, COVID-19 didn't just up and disappear. And so we were all kind of under tremendous health and mental and financial strains even before this happened. Frustrations, wanting to do something to address DE&I, but not sure how. Okay. So these are great responses. Thank you so much for taking the time to contribute to them. I want to tell you kind of what I've been hearing the most from leaders, and it echoes a lot of those sentiments that you just shared. So the biggest challenges from my practice perspective that I've heard are diverse representation in leadership, leadership talking about diversity in a meaningful way, leveraging diversity to drive specific outcomes. So thinking about the business case for diversity and inclusion, integrating a multi-generational workforce, employer brands to attract millennials. And I think that goes a lot to kind of the statements that we've been hearing and seeing on our social media feeds and in the news and on company websites around, you know, their statements against anti-racism and what they're doing next. That's very much a part of their branding and marketing. And certainly, I'm sure it's connected to kind of their move forward strategies in attracting future employees. And the last area that we hear about a lot is defining and measuring and validating what current diversity and inclusion is at the organization. And so diversity is often easier to measure from a demographic perspective, but measuring inclusion, understanding what it means, and how you can really track changes over time is something that many, many leaders struggle with. One thing I like to point out is that, diversity and inclusion is not a point in time. It's not a destination. It is a journey. And, oftentimes we think of what the organization or our top leaders should be doing to create a culture of inclusion. However, what's important to realize is that a sustainable, inclusive culture requires commitment at every single level. So at the organizational level with the C-suite, at the local manager level, as I mentioned before, and as well as the individual and team level. I truly believe that everyone has a responsibility to contribute in some way to an inclusive environment in the workplace. And one point I want to make that's related to a lot of the conversation we're hearing in the media right now is that inclusion is not passive. So we know that diversity is a fact in today's world in terms of demographic diversity and diversity of backgrounds and experiences. But inclusion is a strategy to engage and leverage your diverse workforce. And so inclusion, I look at it as having both a verb and an emotional outcome. So inclusion is the active process of change. So you have to do something is to include. So it's actually something you have to actively do, as well as a feeling. So an emotional outcome of I feel included. And by using this kind of a mental framework, it gets you beyond just feelings of belongingness. How are you actively making sure that employees feel like they belong and not just waiting for their emotional outcomes? And so, in order for inclusive cultures to create a competitive advantage that matches the moral imperative that we talked about earlier, it's important for us to value unique perspectives and contributions of all, and remember that inclusion is not passive. It's something we have to actively work with intention. Now, from my work, I've seen organizations on this continuum, on the journey to inclusion. Many organizations first started their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives around compliance with government regulations and laws around fair employment practices, compensation equity, and other things that were really evaluated kind of from a legal standpoint. Particularly in the 1990s in the United States, there were many class action lawsuits around diversity and inclusion. And so companies really wanted to make sure they were doing what they could to avoid legal action. So many times their efforts do not go very far beyond compliance. But the next level, once companies did start to shift beyond that compliance mindset, was more about awareness. And so, having a sense of defining diversity and inclusion, starting to understand the business case for how a diverse workforce could contribute to their business outcomes. And they would do actionable things like implementing policies and systems to manage diversity. However, the fact is that even at that second awareness level, there was limited comfort with respect to discussing diversity and making changes that disrupted the systemic inequalities that were pervasive in organizations. Now, most of my clients that I've worked with would say they were at that awareness level. They have policies in place, they're doing things like training, and they might teeter between awareness and commitment, but many of them struggle to still have a deep cultural understanding of the barriers to inclusion. And I think that's what this current moment in time is showing us, that, though we have great programs and policies in place, they're really not moving the needle. And so there's still some challenge for us feeling that we're really at a place of understanding and towards true inclusion. If you're at that commitment and understanding level, you recognize the value and importance of differences. You understand how they're connected to employee engagement and other important employee experience outcomes. So not just thinking about the company's overall bottom line or recruitment strategies, but what does diversity and inclusion mean for the employee experience? What is it like to be a woman working in this organization? What is it like to be a Black employee in this organization? Really having that understanding of the company's culture. And, though inclusion is not a destination, some things that you might see in a culture that really is forward in that inclusion process are, people feeling a sense of belongingness, having managers who are able to have difficult conversations around inclusion, and recognizing personal beliefs and biases that might get in the way of having an inclusive environment. And so one thing I like to do is just ask, if you had to put your company on a scale from 1 to 4, where would they be? Just kind of ask yourself that question. And that can tell you a lot about the direction that you might need to go in the future. Now, there's been great debate amongst, scholars and practitioners alike around the business case versus the moral case for diversity and inclusion. What I can say is that, before, the current events, many of my clients would tell me that, I want to move forward diversity and inclusion initiatives. However, I can't get leadership to buy in. I can't get the necessary budget. And so I really need help with curating the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion at my organization. And that's where kind of research meets practice, because there has been lots of research by my colleagues in academia that show the outcomes of having a truly diverse and inclusive culture. So some things like higher employee engagement, faster problem solving, increased profits, improved hiring results, reduced employee turnover, increased creativity, better company reputation, and the list truly goes on. But what happens is if leaders don't understand these connections to outcomes that they care about in terms of diversity and inclusion, it becomes kind of the flavor of the month. And that's what we want to avoid in this moment moving forward. What we've seen happen time and time again in the past is that there becomes all this energy around diversity and inclusion. We want to do the right thing. We really believe in it. But then when other things become, more in the spotlight of what's happening, maybe COVID-19, maybe other things, then we start to forget this moral imperative that we had around diversity and inclusion, and we see that these efforts lose steam, lose resources, and ultimately don't have the impact that we would hope. So how do we create an inclusive environment? What things should we be really thinking about and focusing on? I really like this framework by colleagues Prime and Shore teams. And I love this framework because they really broke down the underpin of kind of human nature. As humans, we all have this kind of balance, that internal tension that we're trying to balance of being both feeling like we're unique, but also feeling as if we belong to a larger group. And so, striking this balance is what organizations should be really thinking about in terms of creating inclusive culture. So I want to break that down a little bit more for our understanding. So the inclusion action framework that I like to use is looking at, okay, how does uniqueness play a role in this culture, and how does belongingness play a role in our culture? And what does that mean when you have one without the other? So first, if we look at an environment that has a low value in uniqueness and a low value in belongingness, what you really are seeing is an environment where there's exclusion. The individual is not treated as an organizational insider, or someone that's unique to the work group, and they're oftentimes excluded altogether. And we would call this an extremely toxic work environment. And, people are not likely to stay in that environment. I would hope that they didn't stay in that environment because those environments really are not good for the employee well-being at all. So we don't see that as much these days. What we do see, though, are the next two areas of this framework are assimilation. And so when you have a low value in uniqueness, but a high value in belongingness, we often see employees feeling like they have to change their individual identity just to fit into their organization. And they're not comfortable, with truly bringing their whole self to work. And so one example that you might think about is back in the United States, back in the 90s, the military had a don't ask, don't tell policy for the LGBTQ community. And so this was a military policy that, military persons, as what they were free to be gay, bisexual, lesbians, instituted by the Clinton administration as long as they did not say that they were different, right? And so we accept you as long as we don't know you're different. And that's not true inclusion. It's really assimilation, and that's not a place where employees can thrive and where diversity is really valued. So the next area in this framework that is differentiation, and this is one that people really struggle with understanding, that you could have a high value in uniqueness, but a low value in belongingness. So think about someone who might be an individual contributor. They might be valued for their insights, but not embraced as fully a part of the larger team. Think about a water boy or girl on a high school football team. He might be valued for the service he brings, but not embraced as a full member of the team. I often hear this from my clients who have very skilled kind of IT departments, and the IT department might sit, separately from others in the organization, and they're super valued and they're really unique because of their skills, and the organization couldn't move forward without their IT support. However, they often feel like they're not getting invited to some of the other kind of company culture outings, or feeling like they really belong because though they're valued, they don't feel like they belong to the larger culture. So differentiation is something you also want to watch out for. Now, in an ideal world, in an ideal company culture, there is inclusion. And so it's when you have both a high value in uniqueness and a high value in belongingness. This is an example of when you have an active process of inclusion. And so remember, I talked about that verb to include, as well as the emotional outcome of feeling included. And so an organization that really makes active changes to include their employees, as well as, having a pulse on employees' feelings around inclusion, that would be, the ideal case. So I want to quickly talk about, inclusive conversation. So, the framework I just discussed gives us kind of a way to think about inclusion, but, what needs to happen in order for that to take place? Well, one thing that we know is that leaders have to be able to have inclusive conversations. In studies that I did back in 2017, we did a survey of the United States population and asked a simple question of workers. We asked, in the past 4 months, has your company's leadership communicated with workers about diversity and inclusion in the workplace? Simple yes and no responses. So 59% said yes, 40% said no. But what was interesting is what we found in the results of those that said yes and no. We found a almost opposite outcome of engagement based on correlational outcomes with engagement based on whether their leaders had communicated or not about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And so as you see on this chart, 68% were engaged when leaders had communicated in some way about diversity and inclusion, versus 30% when they said no. But those numbers are almost directly flipped when they said no, leaders have not communicated about diversity and inclusion in the workplace, 63% were actively disengaged. And so what this correlational relationship tells us is that it does matter if your leaders are talking about diversity and inclusion and addressing it, even if they don't always have the perfect right things to say. We've seen a lot of companies struggle with, what to say and what not to say. But we know that it's important to talk about diversity and inclusion, even if you're acknowledging that you don't have the very best things to say. And that goes back to kind of the framework that I provided at the beginning of this talk. So, we know from outcomes of engagement and other feelings that are connected to employee belongingness, and feeling like they're psychologically safe, that leaders at least having conversations and not being afraid to broach the tough topics are really important. Okay. So beyond, what we can say from a leadership perspective and from a manager perspective, there are specific diversity management practices in place that many of us might be familiar with. And so from Cox's 1991 model of cultural diversity management, we see the areas that most organizations are still using when they think about their diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. From leadership commitment, so those statements that we're talking about, from research and evaluation, having training, focusing on change in the cultural management system and styles, and then following their evaluation system and processes, really having a system of accountability and continuous improvement. Now, I wish we had time to talk about all of these, but I'll talk about kind of what the one I hear most often. And most often, companies come to me to understand training. What should they be doing from a training perspective? It's honestly usually the first line of defense for organization. And, that's what I've seen these last 10 days, very much so that, what organizations really are focused on in this moment is training. So with that, I want to ask just one other question from you all. What types of DE&I training have been most effective in your organization? If you've had, training in your organization, what kind has been most effective? So we'll just give it a moment here. I see some responses coming in, and I will switch the screen so we can all share together. Okay, here we go. All right, so lots of unconscious bias training. That's excellent. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Not having any bias training, conversation focus. Okay, one and done model. So some positive comments I'm seeing are ones that encourage self-reflection and sharing. Excellent. Let's see. Online training doesn't feel as effective. Anything else? Anonymous collaborative learning. I like that. That's great. Lots of unconscious bias training. Having top leaders participate. So not the type of training, but kind of the element of training. I like this example. So we have an annual leadership summit for Hispanic Americans and African American employees, resource groups. I love that. That's great. Face-to-face sessions in small groups, YouTube and personal stories, confronting each other with our biases and understanding where they come from. Helping people define access and inclusion versus equity, versus racial equity. Excellent. Thank you all for these great suggestions. But as we see, there's a range. There's lots of bias training. That is usually the most popular training. But there's a range in understanding if that training is effective or not, and what they should actually be doing. And so I'm going to switch back to my slides here and talk about just that. Does diversity and inclusion training work, particularly around bias training? But we'll talk about diversity and inclusion training kind of broadly for the next few minutes here. So back in 2018, I wrote an article that commented on Starbucks. As you may remember, back in May of 2018, they closed their whole Starbucks operation for training of nearly 175,000 employees. As a result of a racist incident, which a white manager in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania requested that the police remove 2 Black men from the store. And so, everyone was looking at Starbucks to understand, okay, what happened here and what is Starbucks going to do as a result? Well, not surprisingly, Starbucks' first line of defense was to do training. So they shut down the whole organization for this unconscious bias training. And so this begs the question of, does diversity and inclusion training actually work? Was this the right response? So let's step back and think about what we know from our research on about the effectiveness of diversity training. A meta-analytic study of over 40 years of research on diversity training evaluation by Caruza and colleagues talked a lot about when training is most effective. What that meta-analysis showed is that training is effective when it meets 3 conditions. First, the training is complemented by other diversity initiatives. Second, the training targets both awareness and skills development. And third, the training is conducted over a significant period of time. So that gets to someone's comment about, training being one and done. But let's dig into these a little bit more. So this is where I often see the push and pull between research and practice. So in research, as the meta-analysis showed, training is effective when it's complemented by other diversity initiatives. However, in practice, I see that training is seen, as in the Starbucks example, as the first and only line of defense to DE&I issues. And so there's a clear mismatch between what research tells us is effective and what oftentimes our diversity and inclusion leaders are either empowered to do or have the knowledge to do as far as what their strategies should be. Diversity and inclusion training is great, but it cannot be your only line of defense. And it may not need even to be your first line of defense if you don't have an understanding of what your diversity challenges are. It's not effective to jump right into training if you don't understand, what your needs are in terms of diversity and equity in your organization. So the second part that the meta-analysis highlighted was that training is effective when training targets both awareness and skills development. Now, again, this is the pull between research and practice. In practice, what I've seen is that most HR and learning and development teams design training based on a topic of interest and not the desired behavioral changes. So, for example, if you want your employees to be able to have tough conversations around race, that doesn't happen by just listening to someone who knows how to talk about race give a presentation. That might be a great first start for having more awareness of the right phrases to use, the right way to ask questions for inquiry. However, if you want behaviors to change, the training must provide knowledge, skills, as well as the space to experiment with failure in order to lead change. So training should provide a space that leaders and managers can participate in actual tough conversations and get feedback and get affirmation that even though it might be uncomfortable, even though they don't do it perfectly the first time, they're on the right path for behavior change. So that's the second area that I see, is that, trainings are not often developed based on the end in mind. And the last thing that the meta-analysis talked about is that training is effective when it targets, when it is conducted over a significant period of time. So in practice, though, what we see is that DE&I training is largely event-based, and so we can think about our current state of affairs in the world as an event. So it's all often event-based and does not become integrated into the overall employee development strategy. If you think about other areas of employee development, often you have periodic skills development or training that you might be a part of, or might even be required to partake in as part of your role. But what we see for D&I training is that there's not this systematic connection between employee development and having skills around diversity and inclusion. Particularly for leaders, we see, leaders can ascend an organization based off of their skill sets, but having skill sets around DE&I is not considered critical for leadership, promotion, and ascension in the workplace, which I would challenge is one of the things that's really holding us back. And so training can be effective, but it has to be effective over a significant period of time. So what's my advice? What do we do in terms of diversity and inclusion training and making it more effective? Well, first, I say you have to understand the goal of your training. With my clients, I often ask them, what do you want people to feel? What do you want people to think? And what do you want people to do as a result of your training? And it sounds like a simple mechanism, but oftentimes clients take a pause and say, oh, I never even thought about that. I don't really know what I want them to feel. Well, maybe I want them to think about, the statistics that we're sharing. And I'm not sure what I want them to do. I just want them to be better, right? So that's not an effective strategy, particularly for training. You really want to have some clarity in the training development process around what you want people to feel, what you want them to think, and what you want them to do. Do you want to drive awareness? Is this about, for example, in the current state of affairs, is this about making sure that everyone has awareness of what's going on in the company's policies in support of Black Lives Matter, for example? Are you trying to drive conversations? Are you trying to upskill your managers to be able to have better conversations around these topics? Or are you trying to change behavior? So, all of these are examples, and there are many more outcomes that you might focus on, but not having clarity around your goal for the training is your first misstep and often won't lead to your desired outcomes. The second thing I would say to change your approach to diversity training is to test.
Can we just do a couple more minutes, so we leave some time for questions?
Oh yeah, just 2 more slides. So the next thing I would say is change your customization of your experience. And so off-the-shelf training is often not effective, particularly off-the-shelf training often misses really important cultural nuances within the organization and leaves people feeling like the training wasn't meant for them. And people often disengage with training when it's not customized. So one size does not fit all when it comes to training. Even if it's on a topic like unconscious bias, it's important to understand how does unconscious bias really show up for us within our organization. And the last thing I'll say is to change your approach to diversity training is to shift your thinking. So understand that it takes time and value partnerships, both internally and externally, to shift your thinking and have changes over time. I really like this example that PwC has published in terms of their journey around diversity and inclusion. You know, they have not always been at the forefront of diversity and inclusion as they are now. And so, you know, by publicly sharing their timeline, it's acknowledging that it's a journey and that that it's not just something that happens overnight. So to conclude, you know, what does diversity and inclusion training work? It certainly can. It certainly is helpful. We do know that from research. However, if we go back to our example of Starbucks, we know that though they had that massive training back in 2018, they've most recently been in the news again for announcing that employees are not allowed to wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts. And however, you know, after a lot of backlash, they've since changed that policy. But I would question us to think about, you know, if training was effective by itself, would Starbucks have been back in the same precarious situation just 2 years after they had the big issue before and led to unconscious bias training for the whole company? So with that, thank you for your attention. I want to turn it over to some questions and welcome some great dialogue.
Fantastic, Ella. No, that's superb. We covered a lot of ground as always, and I know there's lots to be covered here. So thank you for doing that. Yeah, I thought the two engagements with the audience were really fascinating. There was a huge sort of homogeneity or agreement around the big topics there. On the first one, there seemed to be that sort of nervousness or lack of certainty about how to engage with people. And then on the second one, clearly the unconscious bias training was coming through strong and clear. It seems to me that we're in a particular moment at the moment where we can engage really easily in these conversations because it's so present. And that does seem to be the key thing to do. So, and you pointed that out very clearly, some starters for conversations. But is that the simplest thing to do you think at the moment? The next simple step that people should be doing is just engaging in those conversations?
So I would say yes, that is a kind of low-hanging fruit, if you will, in terms of what they can be doing. But conversation without intention can often lead to even more frustration, right? And so just having a conversation and asking your Black employees, for example, to talk about all the issues they might have with the organization's culture, if nothing is planned to be done as a result of that conversation, it just leads to further frustration and further chasms between employee groups. And also, it's quite unfair to ask any employee group to kind of hash, you know, what areas of pain and what areas of inequalities they're feeling, and kind of be vulnerable in that moment to share those things and to not kind of respect it enough to move forward with it. And so, yes, I think conversations are great, but conversations without intention often fall on deaf ears. The other thing I would say is, you know, you have to acknowledge where you are in the relationship with your employees. And so, for example, if you never have conversations and asking how employees are and connecting with them on a level beyond kind of just their work tasks, it's quite awkward and can seem disingenuous if you're now all of a sudden trying to have these in-depth conversations around race and other really painful topics for some, when, you know, you don't even know, like, if they have a family outside of work, right? You don't even know their dog's name, right? And so kind of understanding that it's still okay to try to broach those topics because it's important and it's needed, but you also have to kind of be honest about where you are. You can't, you know, kind of skip steps. You have to acknowledge that maybe you don't have that relationship and try to build that before you expect your employees to kind of bear all to you.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. Right, we've got lots of questions coming in and we've only got a handful of minutes, so let's see how many we can get through. There's one here from Kristen, looking at the top level of organizations, saying, what have you seen regarding the role of corporate boards or governing boards in DEI? And do you have any recommendations or resources regarding the significance of their role?
Absolutely. So, I mean, boards have a huge say in who is the leader of the organization, what things get enacted. I mean, really, the CEOs of most organizations really rely on their board in terms of direction. But first, before boards can really, I think, provide good direction to organizations, they have to be diversified themselves. And so part of the challenge with, asking your board for direction around diversity and inclusion is that your board likely is not diverse. And so it really has to be, challenged at every level of the organization, including the board, to have more diverse representation and appreciation of difference instead of, having just boards that look very homogeneous.
Brilliant. A question here from Serena. So many companies are talking about D&I, but fewer are talking about equality, and even fewer about racial equity equality. Is this your observation as well? And what are your recommendations for moving the conversation to equity, knowing that authentic D&I is required to achieve that?
Yeah, so, my observation is that companies are trying to do quick action. They're trying to feel like a part of the conversation. They're trying to appease their employees and maybe their other stakeholders by doing things that can be seen as a quick action. So large donations to causes such, related to Black Lives Matter, trying to make great statements, and saying they're going to, they're committed to anti-racism long term. They're talking a lot about these things, but they're doing things that are quick, right now, and maybe they're thinking about even training, but they're not stopping to just take a pause and be self-reflective in terms of what are our challenges around equity, as the question states, and equality in our organization. And that's not something that you can understand overnight. You really have to take the time to analyze the data that you have. You have to take the time to talk to employees. You might need to, invest in some external resources that can help you get a true snapshot of what's happening culturally within your organization before you can then move into action. And so organizations moving into this quick action, I would challenge them to think about this, because it's not likely that they'll have long-term change if they don't.
We've got a question here from someone who's saying, well, what do you recommend to an organization that's all white led, but has explained their lack of diversity by saying we've tried to hire diverse staff and board, but have been unsuccessful?
Yeah, I would push back. I would push back and say, we didn't say diversity was easy. We said that it was necessary, right? And we are talking about that it's a moral imperative. But it also supports the business case of why diversity is good for organizations. And so, I challenge leaders when they give me those comments, because if there were any other kind of pipeline issue, if they couldn't, get enough coders, or they couldn't, have the best marketing team, leaders find ways to enact other strategies, right, outside of diversity and inclusion, all the time. And so when it comes to diversity and inclusion and they just say, oh, well, we just couldn't find someone, I just don't buy that. And I push them to think a little bit more deeply about better strategies, or employing some help that can, help with that.
Interestingly, in response to that question that someone else has asked, or your answer is, how do you push back without being seen as a troublemaker?
Well, I would say two things. I think there's power in numbers. And so, as you connect with your local teams and your local level managers and have these conversations, the more people in the organization that are asking these questions and are demonstrating that it's really important, the better, right? So culture change happens when there is this kind of collective buy-in. So it's not just that one person at the top of the organization, it's having these conversations throughout. Now, secondly, I think that if we're really committed to anti-racism in this moment, we have to be committed to pushing back. We can't be afraid to push back. And so I know that's uncomfortable to hear, but, not saying things, being neutral, being silent in these situations in the past is what got us here. And so if we really want to see change, we have to have some activism on our parts. We have to have our allies that are really willing and able to amplify Black voices and other disenfranchised voices. And sometimes that will be speaking up. And so it's a personal decision if that's, the route you want to take. But, there's no kind of sidelines anymore. I think you have to either be with a cause that is supporting anti-racism and equality, or if you're staying silent, you're effectively being complicit to the issues.
Yeah. Another question, we've got lots of questions coming in. There's a question here saying, what do you think about companies implementing a strategy to accept equal amounts of job applications from people of color and white applicants?
Yeah, so I think any blanket quotas that aren't informed with knowledge and kind of the research that my academic colleagues and I have done, they still aren't smart strategies. Again, we wouldn't employ a strategy that's not research-based or backed in any other space in our organization. We wouldn't just jump to a new financial model without really understanding the possible implications of it. And so just changing a blatant strategy to say we're going to hire 50% Blacks and 50% whites, to me is not an effective strategy, and it's not sustainable. People don't buy into strategies that don't have a strong rationale. If over time. And so it might work in the near term, but in the long term, I don't see it as being effective.
Yeah. And does that apply to the quotas overall, do you think?
Yeah, I think you have to have a rationale for a quota or any other change you're making. If you're changing your promotion policies, what's the rationale behind it? It should be research-based in terms of understanding we want to implement this particular promotion policy to support diversity and inclusion because in the past 10 years we've seen this trend, right? That would be a rationale for changing something. If someone just wakes up one day and says, okay, I'm just going to change this without understanding the potential downstream effects and unintended consequences, it can lead to negative consequences for the people that they are trying to help.
No, absolutely. This is a sort of very particular issue here I've got from Odaya, who says, how can I tackle the problem of diversity by members of the minority who are rejecting any initiatives to diversify or promote awareness? And he says, I suggested something for International Women's Day, but it was the two women who rejected it on the basis of things like, we don't need it at our company.
Mm-hmm. So you have to think about diversity and inclusion as not doing something just on behalf of the one or two people that you might see in your organization. If you're truly looking to have a diverse company, it has to go beyond just, appeasing your friends, right? Or the people that you work with. And so if he wanted to do International Women's Day, he should be advocating because it's important, not just because, it might benefit the two women that were on the team. There are many reasons why someone might have that response. Oftentimes there is lots of pressure on you when you are the only one or one of few women, for example, or Black employees. And so, there are a lot of different defense mechanisms that people have had to have in organizations. And so right now it can feel, as I talked about before, a bit disingenuous for organizations just all of a sudden to care, and it's hard to trust that. And so I would say, if you are really committed to these DE&I changes, you have to be committed beyond, just representing, the voices of the few people that you might know.
Well, in fact, he's replied, or she's replied, sorry, I don't know, saying that there are lots of women in the company, but in fact, these are the two decision makers, presumably senior management, who knocked it back. But it's difficult to give answers if you don't know the exact context. I appreciate we've only got a couple of minutes left. What do you think is the, would you be pleased to see as the sort of obvious shift to have happened from the current situation we've got? And I think that bit around the intent that you mentioned is absolutely critical, isn't it? It's that shift in mindset that people. But what's is there a marker, a benchmark, a measurement of something that you be able to point to and say, well, we saw that progress?
Yeah, so I think if companies are truly reflective and honest about what has held them back in the past, and go beyond the easy answers of it's hard for us to recruit or it's hard for us to retain. Really dig a bit deeper to understand why has it been hard for us to recruit or retain? What is it about our culture? What is it about the way our leadership, is creating an environment around these issues? And really being honest with themselves and then creating long-term strategies with some accountability. And so without part one, there is no part two, in terms of without really understanding what your issues are, you can't have a long-term strategy with accountability. And so I would think that if organizations take both of those steps and are committed to them, then we can see long-term change.
Hello. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. We're time's up. We've rattled through the hour, and thank you so much for going through the tactics, because I think that there seems to be a huge appetite and desire for understanding how to handle this, and so that's superb. You're happy to share a PDF of the slides? Is that okay? Because I know people have been asking. So yes, so we will distribute a PDF of the slides in the coming days with the recording. But thank you once again so much. I know that your time is very precious at the moment, and but this has sparked an enormous interest, and people can follow up and find out more about your program and hopefully get in contact with you through the McDonagh Business School. So thank you all for joining us, and Ella, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.